Daniel bought the house. Chris kept renting. Same age, same city, same $90,000 salary, same $60,000 in savings, and both were looking at the exact same $400,000 house. Daniel put down $80,000, signed a 30-year mortgage, and walked through the front door feeling like he'd finally made it. Chris handed his landlord a check, transferred the rest of his savings into investments, and went home to an apartment that technically wasn't his. They both think they made the smarter choice. They're both wrong. Because the real difference between renting and buying doesn't show up on the day you get the keys. It appears slowly, quietly, year after year. And by the time Daniel and Chris reach their 5th year, the gap between their financial positions will be very different from what either of them expected. This isn't a story about whether houses are good or bad. It's a math problem. So let's make it fair. Daniel and Chris are both 35 years old. They live in Dallas, Texas. They each earn $90,000 a year before taxes. They each have $60,000 in cash. Neither has credit card debt. Neither has children for this calculation. And both expect to stay in the same city for at least 10 years. Daniel chooses to buy the $400,000 house. Chris chooses to rent a comparable property for $2,200 a month. Now here's where the story gets interesting. Daniel's $80,000 down payment leaves him with negative $20,000 if we include roughly $12,000 in closing costs and prepaid expenses. So he can't actually spend the entire $60,000 savings account on the down payment. He needs another $32,000 to make the purchase safely. For simplicity, let's assume he has access to that cash and begins with $28,000 in emergency reserves after closing. Chris, meanwhile, doesn't need the $80,000 down payment. He keeps his $60,000 invested. That sounds like an enormous advantage. But Daniel gets something Chris doesn't. Leverage. Daniel controls a $400,000 asset with $80,000 of his own money. That's the part people love talking about. Chris controls no house. Daniel gets the keys. Chris gets an investment account. One feels permanent, the other feels invisible. And feelings and math are two very different things. Daniel's mortgage is $320,000 at 5% for 30 years. His principal and interest payment is about $2,023 a month. Then add property taxes, which we'll estimate at 8% of the home's value, or about $7,200 in the first year. Homeowner's insurance adds roughly $2,800. Maintenance at 1% of the home's value adds another $4,000. So Daniel isn't really paying $2,023 a month. In the first year, his mortgage, taxes, insurance, and maintenance average roughly $3,000 a month. Chris starts at $2,200. And Chris has another advantage. He invests the difference. But there's a catch. Rent doesn't stay at $2,200 forever. We'll assume rent rises 3% per year, and we'll assume the house appreciates 3% per year. We'll also assume Chris earns an average 7% annual return on his invested portfolio. Not guaranteed. Just a consistent assumption so we can compare the two paths. Now, let's go to year 1. Daniel's house is still worth about $400,000 if we don't count appreciation yet. His mortgage balance has fallen from $320,000 to roughly $315,500. So he has about $84,500 of home equity. On paper, that's $84,500. Sounds great until you subtract everything else. Daniel paid approximately $12,000 in closing costs. He spent around $4,000 on maintenance. He paid roughly $7,200 in property taxes and $2,800 in insurance. Those costs don't become equity, they're gone. And if Daniel sold immediately, he'd also face selling costs that could easily reach tens of thousands of dollars. Chris looks different. He still has his $60,000 investment portfolio. If it earns 7%, that's about $4,200 of growth. He also paid $26,400 in rent during the year. And because his rent was cheaper than Daniel's total housing cost, he had roughly $800 a month available to invest. That's another $9,600. So by the end of year 1, Chris has roughly $73,800 invested before considering taxes and market fluctuations. Daniel has about $84,500 in home equity, but he's also absorbed substantial transaction and ownership costs. That's why simply comparing mortgage payments to rent doesn't work. The mortgage payment is only one line on the spreadsheet. Year 3 is where people start getting uncomfortable. Daniel's house, assuming 3% annual appreciation, is now worth roughly $437,000. His mortgage balance is around $306,000. That puts his gross equity near $131,000. On paper, that's $131,000. Sounds great until you subtract everything else. Over those 3 years, Daniel has paid roughly $26,000 in property taxes, around $9,000 in insurance, and approximately $12,000 in maintenance. That's about $47,000 before we even talk about closing costs or selling expenses. And his mortgage interest has consumed a significant portion of his monthly payment. Chris's rent has risen from $2,200 to about $2,335 a month by year 3. That sounds worse than year 1. But he has also been investing consistently. His original $60,000, growing at 7%, becomes roughly $73,500 after 3 years. Then his monthly investment contributions add additional capital. By the end of year 3, Chris can be around $105,000 to $110,000 in investments, depending on market returns and exactly how consistently he invests the monthly difference. So now we have something interesting. Daniel has more gross equity, Chris has more liquid financial assets, and neither number tells the entire story. Because Daniel owns a house that costs money every month, whether the market goes up or down, Chris owns assets he can sell tomorrow, but Chris doesn't have leverage. If the house rises from $400,000 to $437,000, Daniel gained about $37,000 in property value on an original $80,000 down payment. That's the power of leverage. But leverage works both ways. If the house falls 10%, Daniel loses roughly $40,000 in property value. That's half of his original down payment before accounting for selling costs. Chris doesn't have that particular risk. Then we reach year 5. This is the first real checkpoint. Daniel's house is now worth approximately $463,700 if it appreciates at 3% annually. His mortgage balance is around $298,000. So his gross equity is approximately $165,700. On paper, that's $165,700. Sounds great until you subtract everything else. Across 5 years, Daniel has paid approximately $38,000 in property taxes. Insurance has cost roughly $15,000. Maintenance at 1% of the property's value has cost roughly $21,000. Closing costs were around $12,000. That's approximately $86,000 in ownership expenses before considering mortgage interest. And that's the number most people never put next to their home equity. Chris's rent has reached roughly $2,480 a month by year 5. Over the entire 5-year period, he's paid somewhere around $140,000 in rent. That sounds terrible. But rent bought him flexibility, liquidity, and the ability to invest the capital he didn't lock into the house. His original $60,000 growing at 7% for 5 years becomes roughly $84,200. His additional monthly investments can push his portfolio toward roughly $145,000 to $155,000, depending on market performance. Now stop right here. Daniel has roughly $165,700 in gross home equity. Chris has roughly $150,000 in investments. At first glance, Daniel wins. The homeowner has more. But that's not the final comparison. Because if Daniel sold the house for $463,700, he wouldn't receive $165,700 in cash. Selling expenses could easily consume around 6%, or roughly $27,800. That drops his sale proceeds before taxes and other adjustments to around $135,900 of usable equity. And suddenly the story changes. The person who appeared richer on paper isn't necessarily richer after friction. That's the flip point. Not because buying is bad, not because renting is secretly superior, but because the real calculation isn't rent versus mortgage. It's rent versus the total economic cost of owning. And once you include taxes, insurance, maintenance, closing costs, selling costs, mortgage interest, investment returns, appreciation, and the opportunity cost of the money tied up in the house, the answer becomes much less obvious. And we're only halfway through the timeline. Because the really strange part happens when Daniel and Chris stop looking at 5 years and start looking at 10 and 20. At year 10, Daniel's house is worth about $537,600 if it continues appreciating at 3% a year. His mortgage balance has fallen to roughly $267,000. That gives him about $270,600 in gross equity. On paper, that's $270,600. Sounds great until you subtract everything else. Daniel has now spent roughly $80,000 on property taxes, about $30,000 on insurance, and approximately $50,000 on maintenance over the decade. And remember, mortgage interest has been paid every single month. Chris's rent has climbed from $2,200 to roughly $2,900 a month by year 10. That's a painful number, but Chris's original $60,000, compounding at 7%, has grown to approximately $118,000. And the monthly investments he made from the difference between renting and owning have had 10 years to compound. Depending on the exact cash flow difference and market returns, Chris's investment account can be around $240,000 to $260,000. Now Daniel has a larger gross asset. Chris has a larger liquid portfolio. So who won? We still can't answer, because there's one number almost everybody talks about when they discuss buying a house: home equity. It's the flashy number. It's the number on the statement. It's the number people mention at dinner. My house is worth $540,000 and I only owe $267,000. Sounds incredible. But home equity isn't the same thing as cash, and it isn't the same thing as profit. There's a difference. The first hidden layer is maintenance. A common planning rule is around 1% of a home's value per year. On a $400,000 house, that's $4,000. But some years it's $1,500. Then one year the air conditioner dies and costs $8,000. Another year the roof costs $15,000. Another year it's plumbing, appliances, fencing, or foundation work. The house doesn't send you a bill every month, it waits. That's why maintenance feels smaller than it really is. The second hidden layer is property tax, at an initial one. 8% rate. Daniel starts around $7,200 a year. If the home's taxable value rises, that bill can rise too. Over 10 years, that can easily mean tens of thousands of dollars that never become equity. The third layer is insurance. Daniel starts around $2,800 a year. That's another $28,000 over 10 years before accounting for premium increases. The fourth layer is transaction cost. Buying costs money. Selling costs money. If Daniel pays $12,000 to buy and later spends roughly $28,000 selling, that's approximately $40,000 of friction surrounding the transaction. That $40,000 doesn't appreciate, it disappears. The fifth layer is opportunity cost. This one's harder to see. Daniel put $80,000 into the house. Chris kept that money invested. If $80,000 compounds at 7% for 20 years, it grows to roughly $310,000. That's what economists mean by opportunity cost. It's not necessarily a bill you receive. It's the return you gave up by putting money somewhere else. And the sixth layer is flexibility. If Daniel gets a better job 700 miles away in year 4, selling the house can cost tens of thousands of dollars. Chris can give notice. That's not a financial return, but it has financial value. Now let's go back to year 20. This is where buying starts looking much stronger. Daniel's $400,000 house, appreciating at 3% annually for 20 years, would be worth roughly $722,000. His 30-year mortgage balance would be around $185,000, so his gross equity would be approximately $537,000. On paper, that's $537,000. Sounds great until you subtract everything else. But now something important has happened. Daniel has only 10 years left on the mortgage. His housing payment isn't going to rise forever in the same way rent does. Chris's rent, assuming 3% annual increases, has reached roughly $4,000 a month. That's almost $48,000 a year. And this is where the comparison begins to tilt. Daniel still has property taxes, insurance, and maintenance, but his mortgage is moving toward zero. Chris has no ownership stake. He's still paying market rent. If both investments earn 7% and Chris continues investing the difference between his total rent and Daniel's total ownership costs, his portfolio can still become very large. But the result depends heavily on how much of that difference he actually invests. That's the hidden variable. The spreadsheet assumes Chris invests the difference. Real life assumes Chris sees an extra $500 in his checking account and spends it. Those are two completely different people. And that's why renting doesn't automatically create wealth. The renter has to invest. The owner doesn't have to remember to buy an index fund every month. The house itself is forcing a form of saving. Now let's steelman the buying argument. If I only showed you the downsides of buying, I'd be doing what every rent versus buy influencer does. Buying has genuine advantages. First, leverage. Daniel controlled a $400,000 asset with an $80,000 down payment. If the house appreciates 3%, that's a $12,000 increase in property value during the first year. That's a 15% increase relative to his original $80,000 down payment, before expenses and principal reduction. Second, housing costs eventually become more predictable. Once the mortgage is paid off, Daniel no longer has a mortgage payment. Chris never reaches zero rent. Third, buying can provide stability. A landlord can't decide to sell Daniel's house and force him to move because Daniel owns it. Fourth, buying can work extremely well if you stay long enough. If Daniel stays 20 years, the purchase costs are spread over a much longer period. That changes the economics dramatically. And there are situations where renting clearly loses. If comparable rent is $2,200, but buying the same property costs only $2,700 all in, and you're confident you'll stay for 15 years, buying can be compelling. If the rent-to-price ratio is extremely high, renting can become expensive relative to ownership. And if you house hack by renting out part of the property, the math can change completely. Imagine Daniel rents 2 bedrooms for $900 each. That's $1,800 a month. Suddenly, his effective housing cost drops dramatically. That's not a minor adjustment. That's a completely different financial model. On the other hand, renting can win when the price-to-rent ratio is extreme. If a $400,000 house rents for only $1,800 a month, buying becomes much harder to justify financially. The renter can invest the $80,000 down payment, avoid property taxes and maintenance, and maintain mobility. The second scenario is short ownership. If you expect to move within 3 to 5 years, buying can be dangerous because the transaction costs are front-loaded. The third is career uncertainty. If your income or location could change quickly, liquidity has real value. And the fourth is discipline. If you rent and actually invest the difference every month, you're not throwing money away. You're buying housing while directing the rest of your capital toward financial assets. Now let's ground this in actual data. The IRS states that mortgage interest may be deductible for qualified taxpayers, subject to the applicable rules and limits, while property taxes can also receive tax treatment subject to federal limitations. The important point is that tax benefits depend on the taxpayer's situation. They're not automatic profit. And mortgage rates matter enormously. A buyer at 3% and a buyer at 7% are not buying the same financial product, even if they purchase the same $400,000 house. At 5%, Daniel's $320,000 mortgage costs about $2,023 a month in principal and interest. At 3%, the same loan would be roughly $1,349 a month. That's a difference of about $674 every month. Over a year, that's more than $8,000. Over 5 years, that's more than $40,000 of cash flow before considering compounding. One interest rate assumption can completely change the winner. So here's the practical strategy. Before deciding, don't ask, can I afford the mortgage? Ask, what's my total annual cost of ownership? Start with principal and interest. Then add property taxes, add insurance, add maintenance, add HOA fees if there are any, add expected major repairs. Then estimate buying and selling costs, then calculate what your down payment could earn if it stayed invested. Then compare that total with rent. That's step 1. Step 2 is stress test the assumptions. Run the calculation with home appreciation at 0%, 3%, and 5%. Run rent increases at 2%, 3%, and 5%. Run investment returns at 5%, 7%, and 9%. And run the calculation for 5, 10, and 20 years. If the answer only works under one perfect scenario, you don't have a strong financial decision. You have a bet. Step 3 is calculate the break-even point. Ask yourself how many years you need to stay before buying becomes financially competitive. If buying costs $50,000 more upfront and saves you $500 a month afterward, that's 100 months just to recover that difference. That's more than 8 years, and that's before investment returns. This is where most people make the mistake. They compare monthly rent with monthly mortgage. They don't compare total wealth. Daniel and Chris both walked away thinking they made the smart play. Daniel believed owning the house meant he was automatically building wealth. Chris believed renting meant he was avoiding the trap of home ownership. Neither one actually ran the full numbers, because the real trap isn't renting or buying. The real trap is making the decision based on hype, headlines, or someone else's opinion instead of running the numbers for your own situation. The right answer can change with the interest rate. It can change with the rent. It can change with the house price. It can change with taxes. It can change with maintenance. It can change with how long you stay. And most importantly, it can change with what you do with the money you don't spend. A renter who invests every month can become wealthy. A homeowner who keeps buying bigger houses can become house rich and cash poor. And a disciplined homeowner who buys the right property, stays for decades, and keeps investing can build enormous wealth. There isn't one universal winner. There's only the winner under the numbers you actually face. And if you're wondering what happens when you combine both strategies, buying a home while investing aggressively and using the property to create additional income, that's a completely different conversation. Because sometimes the smartest move isn't choosing between renting and buying. It's figuring out how to make the asset you choose work harder. Daniel and Chris had the same income, the same savings, the same age, and the same city. They simply allocated their money differently. 20 years later, that difference can be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. So before you sign the lease or sign the mortgage, run the entire equation. Did you include everything? Because the answer that includes everything is the only answer that matters. If this video helped you see something you didn't know was there, subscribe to Money Mindset Lab and hit the notification bell. We break down the hidden math behind the financial decisions you face every day.